There is a house on Staten Island that nobody will buy. It sits at the highest natural point on the island, more than 400 feet above sea level, behind iron gates. At the corner of Benedict Road and St. James Place, you cannot see it from the street. 33,000 square feet on almost 2 acres, with views across to the Verrazzano Bridge, a Carrara marble foyer, an indoor Olympic-sized swimming pool, and an outdoor one, a 13-car showroom garage, a home theater, a gym with a sauna, a beauty salon, a wine cellar, a solarium. It was designed to look like the White House, pillared portico, circular drive. The neighbors called it exactly that. The man who built it was Paul Castellano. At the time, the most powerful criminal in the United States. He ran an organization that decided what got built in New York City, and he ran it from his own dining room because he had reached a point where the world came to him. 10 years after he moved in, 4 men in black fur hats shot him to death on a Manhattan sidewalk. And what happened to what he left behind? The widow, the children, the business, and above all the house, is a story almost nobody tells. Because it isn't a story about a murder. It's a story about what a monument is worth once the man who built it is gone. In October of 2023, that house went on the market for $16.8 million. It fell out of contract. It was pulled. It came back a year later at $18 million. In December of 2025, it was withdrawn again. No buyers. Nobody wants it. This is what happened to Paul Castellano's family after he was murdered. He was born Constantino Paul Castellano in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, in June of 1915. His parents were Italian immigrants. His father, Giuseppe, was a butcher and an early member of the Mangano crime family, the organization that would eventually become the Gambinos. From him, the boy learned 2 trades at the same time, side by side, as though they were the same thing: how to cut meat and how to collect receipts for the numbers racket. He left school after the 8th grade. In 1934, at 19 years old, he took part in an armed robbery with 2 friends. The police caught him. They did not catch the others. And when the detectives asked him to name them, he refused and took 3 months in jail rather than answer. It is a small thing. It is also the entire foundation of everything that followed. In that world, a 19-year-old who keeps his mouth shut is not a failed robber. He is an investment. The family connections did the rest. His older sister had married a young man named Carlo Gambino, who would go on to become one of the most powerful crime bosses in American history. Then, in 1937, Castellano married Nina Mano, binding the 2 families together twice over. Carlo Gambino was, in the end, both his cousin and his brother-in-law. He was formally inducted into the Mangano family in the 1940s. But here is what separated Paul Castellano from almost everyone around him, and what would eventually get him killed. He wasn't interested in being a gangster. He was interested in being a businessman. Through the 40s and 50s, he built a genuine commercial operation in meat and poultry. Blue Ribbon Meats, Ranbar Packing, Pride Wholesale Meat and Poultry. Real companies with real trucks and real contracts, supplying real supermarkets. The criminal power and the legitimate business were not separate things he kept apart. They were the same machine. The mob influence made the businesses profitable. The businesses made the mob influence respectable. By 1957, he was senior enough that when the leadership of the American Mafia gathered at a house in upstate New York and the state police raided it, Paul Castellano was among those taken in. Dozens of men in expensive suits ran through the woods that day. He did not run. He surrendered, said nothing about why he was there, and took the consequences. They called him Big Paul because he was 6'3". They also called him the Pope, and later the Howard Hughes of the mob, a man of enormous power who was almost never seen. In 1976, Carlo Gambino died and named him successor. At 61 years old, the butcher's son from Bensonhurst inherited the largest crime family in the United States. And the first thing he did was build the house. He commissioned it that same year. It took 4 years to complete, finishing in 1980. Understand what the location meant. Tot Hill is the most exclusive neighborhood on Staten Island, and the spot he chose is the highest natural ground in the borough, over 400 feet up, with sightlines across the harbor. It was seclusion and elevation at the same time. Private, defensible, and above everything. That was not an accident of taste. It was an operating decision. Castellano did not want to run his organization from a social club or a street corner or the back room of a restaurant, the way his predecessors had. Those places were public. They put a boss in front of witnesses, in front of cameras, in front of anyone who wanted to walk in. He wanted the empire to come to him, so he built somewhere for it to come to. And then he decorated it like a man who had decided he was no longer a criminal. 17 rooms, by the count of the reporters who would later describe it. Marble throughout. 2 Olympic-sized pools, 1 indoors and 1 out. A garage built like a showroom for 13 cars. A screening room. A gym with a sauna. A salon. A wine cellar. A solarium full of light. And the portico, the columns, the circular drive. He had it designed to resemble the White House, and everyone on the Hill, without a trace of irony, started calling it that. Think about the psychology in that for a moment. This is a man who left school at 13, whose father cut meat in Brooklyn, and who at the height of his power chose to live inside a copy of the residence of the President of the United States. Not a fortress, not a compound, a seat of government. That was how he saw himself, not as an outlaw operating against the system, as the head of a parallel one. His neighbors agreed, more or less. When he was murdered, reporters raced to Tot Hill, expecting to find frightened residents. They found the opposite. Nobody had a bad word. Great neighbors, one of them said, a credit to the neighborhood. People on that hill were proud of the white porticoed house. They felt the Castellanos brought a certain class to the place. They were quite sure the family was good for property values. That was the world he built. A crime boss so thoroughly converted into a respectable man that the doctors and lawyers living around him considered him an asset. But a house is a fixed position, and a fixed position can be watched. The same qualities that made the White House perfect for running an organization in private made it perfect for anyone who wanted to know what that organization was doing. He was always there. Everything of importance happened inside those walls. Every conversation that mattered in the same handful of rooms, which meant the federal government did not have to follow him anywhere. They only had to reach one address. By the mid-1980s, what was said inside that house was no longer private, and it wasn't only business that was captured. It was everything: the arguments, the household, the domestic life of a 69-year-old man in the middle of a personal crisis. All of it recorded and eventually laid out for strangers to read. The fortress had become a listening device. The man who had built a palace so he would never have to be seen in public ended up more thoroughly exposed than any boss who ever held court on a street corner. And by then, the people underneath him had a different complaint. Castellano had spent a decade steering the family toward white-collar crime, construction, unions, contracts, the quiet skim-off legitimate industry. That suited him. It did not suit the men who had come up on hijacking and gambling and violence, who felt they were being taxed by a boss who had stopped being one of them. He rarely appeared. He rarely showed his face in the neighborhoods, the money came from. He lived on a hill, in a mansion, behind gates. There was a capo from Queens who felt this very strongly. On the 16th of December, 1985, 9 days before Christmas, Paul Castellano was driven to a steakhouse on East 46th Street in Manhattan for a meeting. He never got inside. 4 men in black Russian fur hats were waiting on the sidewalk. They shot him and his underboss Thomas Bellotti dead in the street, in Midtown, in the middle of the evening, in front of anyone who happened to be walking past. He was 70 years old. The murder had been ordered by John Gotti, who took control of the family within weeks, and who would spend the next 6 years becoming the most famous criminal in America in the most public way possible until the government put him in a cell for the rest of his life. Castellano was buried at Moravian Cemetery in New Dorp on Staten Island, a few miles from the house. And here is where almost every telling of this story stops. It stops because the next part has no gunfire in it. But it is the part that actually answers the question. The empire did not pass to his family. That is the first thing to understand. Whatever a crime boss builds, his children do not inherit it. Not the position, not the authority, not the network. Those went to the man who killed him. What the Castellanos inherited was everything the organization had no use for: the property, the businesses, the name. Nina Castellano, who had married him in 1937 when he was a 22-year-old butcher, got the house. Try to hold that image. A woman in her late 60s, widowed in the most public way imaginable, living alone in 33,000 square feet, built for a man who is not coming back. 17 rooms, 2 Olympic pools, a 13-car garage, a replica of the White House on top of a hill, and 1 person inside it. The children got the businesses, and the businesses were the problem, because Castellano had spent 40 years making sure his legitimate operations and his criminal ones were the same operations. You could not simply keep the clean half. There was no clean half. The family's concrete company on Staten Island did real work for real clients, and it existed inside a world it had not chosen and could not leave. This is the quiet tragedy underneath the whole story, and it has nothing to do with revenge. Nobody in that family took up arms against Gotti. Nobody swore a vendetta. There was no war. They just went to work in the businesses their father had built, in a city where the people who killed him were still running things. And in time, the house left the family altogether. It was sold. The reported price was somewhere around $3 million for the largest and most elaborate private residence on Staten Island, built by the most powerful crime boss in the country. That is what the White House was worth once the Pope was gone. Which brings us to now. In October of 2023, the house at 177 Benedict Road was listed for sale at $16.8 million. If it sold at that number, it would have broken the record for the most expensive home ever sold on Staten Island by millions. It fell out of contract. It was taken off the market and then relisted in October of 2024 at an even higher figure, $18 million. In December of 2025, it was pulled again, no buyer. As of this year, it is not for sale. It simply sits there. And the reasons the property people give are, in their own flat way, the most damning epitaph the man could have received. There is nothing else priced anywhere near that on the island. The recent record for a Staten Island home was $8.5 million for a property directly across the street. So the house is asking more than double what the best address in the borough has ever achieved. And it is, in the words of the broker who sold that record-breaking house, very expensive to renovate. The interior is all marble. Anyone who wanted to change it would be paying enormously for the privilege. The place was customized so completely to one man's idea of what power looks like that the pool of people whose taste happens to match his is now close to zero. Read that again. He built it to be permanent, to be a seat, to be the thing that outlasted him, and announced to Staten Island and to anyone driving past the gates that the Castellanos were not gangsters, but something closer to a dynasty, and it did outlast him. That's exactly the problem. It is still standing, 46 years after it was finished. And its permanence is now the reason it's a liability. It is too big, too specific, too much somebody else's. A monument to a man whose taste nobody shares and whose empire nobody inherited. You cannot renovate it into something normal. You cannot afford to. And you cannot sell it because the only person it was ever really built for is buried a few miles away. There is one more thing. In March of 2019, 34 years after Paul Castellano was shot on a Manhattan sidewalk, another reputed boss of the Gambino crime family was shot to death outside his own home. He also lived on Tot Hill. He is buried in the same cemetery. Two men who ran the same organization, killed 34 years apart, who chose the same hill to live on, and ended up in the same ground. But there is a difference. And the difference is the whole point. When Castellano was killed, the entire city stopped. Reporters climbed the hill. The murder rewrote American organized crime for a decade. When the second man was killed in 2019, the Associated Press noted that he had died a virtual unknown. The hill stayed. The names on it stopped mattering. So, what happened to Paul Castellano's family after he was murdered? They didn't get the empire. They were never going to. They got the paperwork, the companies, the name in the newspapers, and a very large house. And the house, which was supposed to be the proof that they had become something permanent, has now been offered to the open market 3 times and refused 3 times. It stands empty of the meaning it was built to hold, 400 feet above the city, behind iron gates, invisible from the road. That is what happens to a monument. When the thing it was built to commemorate stops existing, it doesn't fall down, it doesn't burn, it just sits there, and nobody wants it.